Final meals and final words are often pretty prosaic affairs, and statements in of themselves. However, they are lent a greater solemnity and importance than they otherwise would have, because of the close presence of the Grim Reaper. Following are 20 things about some final words, final meals and final feasts from history. Number 20. The murderer who insisted that he be executed. American criminal Gary Gilmore, 1940 to 1977, gained national and international fame in the 1970s, when he insisted that he be executed for a pair of murders he had committed in Utah, the son of an alcoholic conman. Gilmore had a highly unstable childhood, as his father roamed the U.S. with his family in tow and made ends meet wherever he landed with petty grifts before he skipped town. The father had a mean temper, and would often whip his children for little or no reason, and beat his wife as well. Gilmore turned to crime early and at age 14, was sent to juvenile prison for auto theft. He continued on the criminal path after his release, and graduated to more serious crimes. In 1964 he was tried in Oregon for assault and armed robbery, and got a 15-year sentence as a habitual offender. He got a conditional release in 1972, but within a month was arrested for armed robbery. Violent behavior behind bars got him transferred from state prison to a federal maximum security lockup in 1975. He was granted parole in 1976 and settled in Utah, where he soon resumed his no-good ways and took to drink, violence and theft. Within a few months he was back behind bars, this time for murder. Number 19. A murderer who tried to hasten his execution, while death penalty opponents fought to save his life. On July 19, 1976, Gary Gilmore robbed and killed a gas station employee in Orem, Utah, and the following day he robbed and killed a motel manager in Provo. He was undone when he accidentally shot himself in the right hand with the pistol he had used in both murders, and left a trail of blood that led back to a service garage, where he had left his truck for repairs. On October 7, 1976, a jury found him guilty and recommended the death penalty. He chose to not pursue his habeas corpus relief rights in federal court. Back then Utah gave the condemned the option of execution by hanging or by firing squad, and Gilmore declared, "I'd prefer to be shot." His execution was scheduled for November 15, 1976, but despite his express wishes, the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, intervened and got multiple stays of execution. What followed was a macabre back and forth that attracted attention both in the U.S. and overseas, as a condemned criminal sought to hasten his execution, while the ACLU tried to save his life. Number 18. Gary Gilmore's final meal. Gary Gilmore did not appreciate the efforts by others to prevent his execution. As he stated at a Board of Pardons hearing in November 1976, "They always want to get in on the act. I don't think they have ever really done anything effective in their lives. I would like them all, including that group of reverends and rabbis from Salt Lake City, to butt out. This is my life and this is my death. It's been sanctioned by the courts that I die and I accept that." While on death row, he tried to commit suicide twice, once on November 16, 1976, just a day after the first day of execution, and again on December 16. The final stay of execution occurred a few hours before he was rescheduled to be executed on January 17, 1977. It did not last long, however, and was lifted at 7:30 a.m. His final meal before he met and before a firing squad at 8:07 that morning was a hamburger, baked potato, hard-boiled eggs, coffee, and 3 shots of contraband Jack Daniel's whiskey. His story became the subject of a novel by Norman Mailer, The Executioner's Song, which went on to win a Pulitzer Prize. Number 17. The slave soldiers who became rulers. The Mamluks, meaning those who were owned, were a warrior class of slave soldiers, and freed slaves assigned various military and administrative duties. On behalf of Arab dynasties in the Muslim world, the system of slave soldiery began in the 9th century with Turkic slaves from the Eurasian steppe, then spread to include those from the Caucasus, the Balkans, Russia, and elsewhere. It lasted for 1,000 years into the 19th century. Although they began as slaves, the Mamluks eventually came to dominate the societies in which they operated. They're present in the Levant, Mesopotamia, and India, but their strongest hold was in Egypt. They ruled Egypt along with Syria, as the Mamluk Sultanate from 1250 to 1517, until defeated by the Ottoman Turks, who conquered those countries. Although defeated, the Mamluks continued as a privileged class, whose social status was higher than the general population. They were deemed to be the true lords and true warriors, and were often the de facto rulers who paid only lip service to the Ottoman Sultan, and ran Egypt as a nearly independent realm. Their run in Egypt finally came to an end in 1811, when they accepted an invitation to a feast from that country's ruthless ruler, Muhammad Ali Pasha. It was to be their final feast. Number 16. The ruthless Albanian mercenary who took over Egypt. Muhammad Ali Pasha, 1769 to 1849, was born in Ottoman-ruled Greece to an Albanian family, and he began his career as a tax collector for the local authorities. He first arrived in Egypt in 1801 as an officer in an Albanian mercenary unit, part of a larger force sent by the Ottomans to reoccupy the country. After Napoleon Bonaparte withdrew French forces from there, the French had defeated the Mamluks and conquered Egypt in 1798. But although weakened, the Mamluks had not been destroyed. They jockeyed with and clashed with the Ottoman forces for power. Amidst the turmoil that ensued, Muhammad Ali proved himself a wily political operator. He used his Albanian mercenaries to work with both factions, and his power and prestige rose steadily. Muhammad Ali also allied with native Egyptian leaders, who distrusted and disliked both Mamluks and Ottomans, and worked hard to gain the general public's support. The final result of his machination was that in 1805, Egyptian notables demanded that the Ottoman Sultan replace his governor in Egypt with Muhammad Ali, and he was forced to yield. The new viceroy next turned his attention to the Mamluks. Number 15. Muhammad Ali's first massacre of the Mamluks. The Mamluks, who had dominated Egypt for more than 6 centuries, posed a serious threat to Muhammad Ali Pasha, and he knew that he would have to deal with them. As a class, they were Egypt's feudal lords, and their vast landed estates were the country's greatest source of wealth and power. Although Muhammad Ali received the title of governor of Egypt in 1805, his undisputed authority was limited to Cairo. Beyond its walls, he was everywhere challenged by the Mamluks. So he decided upon a 2-stage strategy, to first eliminate the Mamluks' leaders, and then eliminate the entire Mamluk class. On August 17, 1805, he fed false intelligence to Mamluk forces encamped north of Cairo that he would leave the city that day with most of his forces to attend a ceremony some miles away. Believing Cairo to be undefended, the Mamluks rushed in to seize the city, only to fall into a carefully prepared ambush by Muhammad Ali and his forces. Surrounded in the city streets, many Mamluks were massacred, dozens of their key leaders were captured, tortured, executed, and their heads were sent to the Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople, with the boast that Mamluk power in Egypt had been broken. Number 14. A last-minute reprieve of the Mamluks. The 1805 defeat and massacre of the Mamluks greatly weakened, but did not eradicate them. Survivors retreated to Upper Egypt and began to unsuccessfully negotiate for a compromise. Muhammad Ali led an expedition that defeated them in 1807, but they were saved at the last minute when news arrived of a British invasion of Alexandria and the surrounding Nile Delta region. Alarmed, the Pasha offered the Mamluks concessions if they joined him to expel the invaders, and they accepted. Together the two forces marched north to deal with the invaders. Divisions soon arose among the Mamluks, however, when one faction advocated cooperation with the British, while the other sought to honor the agreement with Muhammad Ali. It became moot when the British, who had invaded on the assumption that the Mamluks would join them, finally grew disgusted with their dissensions, despaired of their assistance, and evacuated Alexandria in September 1807. An uneasy peace then descended between Muhammad Ali and the Mamluks. Some of their leaders were appointed administrators of certain Egyptian districts, on condition that they pay taxes, and many of them returned to Cairo and resumed their residence there. However, Mamluk forces continued to clash with those of Egypt's governor, until he took a final step to deal with them once and for all. Number 13. An invitation the Mamluks wished they had not accepted. In 1811, an Egyptian army was prepared for a campaign against the Wahhabis in the Arabian Peninsula. During a lull in tensions between Muhammad Ali Pasha and the Mamluks, the latter were invited to a ceremony in the Cairo citadel to invest the governor's son with the army's command. They accepted, and on the morning of March 1, 470 Mamluks, dressed in all their ceremonial finery and armed with shining gilded swords, rode their best horses, richly caparisoned, to the citadel. There they were warmly greeted in the courtyard by Egypt's governor, as they were presented with coffee and hookah pipes. Per hospitality customs, the Pasha struck up casual and friendly conversations with them. Finally, Muhammad Ali rose, a signal to end the ceremony. The guests then mounted their horses and formed in a procession preceded and followed by their host's troops. It was planned that they would ride through Cairo, to be seen by the crowds that lined the streets, until they reached the departing army's camp, where a celebratory feast was to be held. The procession slowly made its way down a steep and narrow road that led to the citadel's great gate Bab al-Azab. The Pasha's troops in front exited the citadel, but soon as the Mamluks reached the gate, it was slammed shut before them simultaneously. The troops behind them raced back to close the exit to the rear. Number 12. The final massacre of the Mamluks. As the procession of Mamluks confined along a narrow path milled about in confusion, before the closed Cairo citadel gate, a signal was given to begin their final eradication. Albanian troops loyal to Muhammad Ali Pasha, placed on the rooftops of nearby buildings that overlooked the trapped Mamluks, opened fire. As an eyewitness described what happened next, it was only moments before the narrow path was crowded, with the corpses of men and horses lying on top of each other, making any movement even more difficult than before. As for the Mamluks who happened to reach the portal Bab al-Azab, they found it closed and turned back their horses. But this caused even more chaos amongst the men and horses that were at the top of the incline, and they in turn tried to turn their horses back to the citadel away from the bullets. However, the infantry spread across the walls, opened fire, killing them in droves, and the mayhem and horror increased. The Mamluks soon realized that their horses were useless, and so they descended to walk on foot and took off their clothes and finery, which only hindered their movements at that terrible time. They started to run, swords and firearms in hand, wanting to meet an enemy to take their revenge for the catastrophe which had befallen them. But they found no one, and the bullets continued to rain down upon them, hitting their mark. Number 11. The final destruction of the warrior slave class that had dominated Egypt for centuries. Of the 470 Mamluks who entered Cairo's citadel on March 1, 1811, only one Amin Bek is reported to have survived the massacre. He was at the back of the procession when the gate was slammed shut. When he saw death closing in upon him from all sides, he spurred his horse into a jump from one of the citadel's walls, from a height of about 65 feet, equivalent to a modern building's 7th floor. The horse died, but Amin Bek miraculously survived and managed to escape to Syria. The events at the citadel kicked off an indiscriminate slaughter of Mamluks throughout Egypt. Muhammad Ali Pasha had instructed subordinates throughout the country to be ready, and when word arrived, they fanned out to slay any Mamluks they could lay their hands on. In Cairo, the Pasha's soldiers began to loot Mamluk houses, and by the time order and discipline were restored among the troops, over 500 houses had been pillaged and trashed. A few Mamluk survivors fled south to Nubia, but even that refuge was lost to them in 1820, when the Pasha's troops invaded and conquered the region. Muhammad Ali had secured the final destruction of Egypt's Mamluks, and he went on to found a dynasty that ruled Egypt until 1952. Number 10. The radical German philosopher. German philosopher and radical socialist Karl Marx, 1818-1883, penned the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, both of which formed the basis of Marxism, and revolutionized the world for better and for worse. Born in Prussia, he experimented with social and political theories in university, and by the 1840s had become a radical journalist. His writings were viewed as dangerous by the authorities, and in the span of a few years he was expelled from Germany, France, Belgium, then Germany again. Marx eventually found a final refuge in London, where he settled and lived for the remainder of his life. Karl Marx's father was a successful lawyer, a man of the Enlightenment, and was a passionate advocate for Prussian reform. He had converted from Judaism to Lutheranism to avoid legal restrictions that barred Jews from high society. He saw to it that his son Karl received a liberal education in a school whose enlightened leanings made it suspect in the eyes of the reactionary authorities. Number 9. A philosopher on the move. The authorities raided Karl Marx's school in the 1830s, confiscated writings deemed subversive from its library, and forced changes in the teaching staff. Marx's early years of higher education were marked by poor grades, imprisonment for drunkenness, riotous behavior, and general rowdiness. Before he finally buckled down to serious study of the law and philosophy, he was strongly influenced by Hegel, and joined a radical student group known as the Young Hegelians. That marked the beginning of his transformation into a radical, and eventually revolutionary, thinker. He received a doctorate in 1841, but his politics kept him from getting a teaching job, so he took to journalism. Within a year, however, his newspaper was suppressed and he was forced to move to Paris and the relatively freer French environment. There, he met Friedrich Engels, and the two developed a friendship and began a collaboration that would revolutionize the world. In 1845, the Prussians pressured the French to expel Marx, so he moved to Belgium, where he founded a correspondence committee to link European socialists. Number 8. Karl Marx's final refuge and final words. Karl Marx's European Socialist Correspondence Committee inspired English socialists to form the Communist League, and they asked Marx and his colleague Friedrich Engels to write a platform for their new party. The result was the Communist Manifesto, which was published in 1848. Shortly thereafter, the authorities kicked Marx out of Belgium, so he returned to France, which also expelled him. He headed back to his birthplace, Prussia, but by then he had been stripped of his citizenship, and the authorities refused to renaturalize him. So in 1849 he ended up in London, the final refuge of European political dissidents in the 19th century. There he spent the remainder of his life writing, and in 1867 published Das Kapital, twinned with the earlier Communist Manifesto. The two works became the philosophical bedrock of Marxism and communist theory. On his deathbed in 1883, just before he succumbed to pleurisy, he was solicited for final words. He replied before he drew his final breath, "Go on. Get out. Last words are for fools who haven't said enough." Number 7. Muhammad Ali Pasha's feast invitation was ruthless, but not as ruthless as some Mongol feasts. As seen above, Muhammad Ali Pasha massacred his Mamluk enemies after he tricked them into accepting an invitation to a celebratory feast. However ruthless as Muhammad Ali was, he was not as ruthless as the Mongols, who not only invited enemies to final feasts as seen below, the invitees had no choice, but then proceeded to feast atop their bodies. The chain of events that led to one such episode began in 1223, after Genghis Khan crushed and conquered the Crimean Empire. He then sent an expedition of about 20,000 men to raid into the Caucasus and southern Russia. Led by Generals Subutai and Jebe, the Mongol force defeated all in its path, and its victims included the Cumans, allies of the Kievan Rus. The Rus came to the Cumans' aid, and a vast army set out after the raiders. The Mongols retreated and their foes pursued. For 9 days, Subutai and Jebe led their pursuers on a merry chase across the steppe, then suddenly turned on their by then strung out enemies at the banks of the Kalka River. Number 6. Defeated Mongol enemies were guests of honor at a final feast celebrated over their still living bodies. The Mongols' reputation for cruelty and bloodthirstiness was well deserved, while those who chose to surrender immediately often found the Mongols to be decent rulers. Woe betide those who resisted. It is estimated that the wars of Mongol conquest might have killed up to 60 million people. One thing that Mongols enjoyed was to make examples out of their defeated foes. On May 31, 1223, the Mongols led by Subutai and Jebe defeated and annihilated their Kievan Rus and pursuers. Things went from bad to worse for the captured enemy commanders when the Mongols decided to celebrate their victory by throwing a feast and to dine over their bodies of their captives. By the banks of the Kalka River, captured enemy commanders were bound and laid on the ground. A huge board was then placed atop their bodies, over which the victors sat to eat, drink, and celebrate their triumph. As the victors roistered, the vanquished were slowly crushed and suffocated to death beneath them. Number 5. A good soldier who became better known for his final words than for his distinguished career. John Sedgwick, 1813-1864, was born into a family of American Revolutionary War veterans, including one grandfather who had served as a general alongside George Washington. Sedgwick became a respected and competent Union general and corps commander during the Civil War. His kindliness and paternal affection, combined with concern for his soldiers' well-being, won him the love of his men and the nickname Uncle John. Unfortunately, he is more widely remembered for his ironic final words than for his solid military career. Sedgwick graduated from West Point in 1837 and was commissioned as an artillery officer. He served ably and was still in uniform when the Civil War broke out in April 1861. He was given command of a cavalry regiment and by August 1861 was promoted to command his own brigade in the Army of the Potomac. By February 1862 was in charge of his own division. He fought bravely in the Peninsula Campaign and was wounded 2 times during the 7 Days battles. Number 4. General Sedgwick's unfortunate final words. At the Battle of Antietam, John Sedgwick was sent on a poorly planned charge, and his division was shot to pieces. He lost 2,200 men and was struck by 3 bullets. When he recovered from his injuries and returned to duty, he was promoted to command his own corps. He won early success with his 6th Corps during the Battle of Chancellorsville in 1863, but the battle ended in a Union defeat. During the Overland Campaign in 1864, he led his corps in the Battle of the Wilderness on May 9, 1864, at the start of the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. As Sedgwick positioned his artillery, his troops came under sniper fire and grew jittery. He chided his men for their timidity under single bullets, and wondered how they would react When they confronted the masked enemy on the firing line and faced full volleys, the men were ashamed but continued to flinch, so Uncle John Sedgwick continued with what became his final words. "Why are you dodging like this?" They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance. That was when his pep speech was interrupted by a sniper bullet that hit him in the face beneath his left eye and killed him instantly. He was the highest-ranking Union general killed on a battlefield in the Civil War. Number 3. A Principled Cleric. Unlike Karl Marx, an extreme atheist, this entry for memorable final words belongs to Hugh Latimer, circa 1487 to 1555, who was extremely religious, an English Protestant bishop. His staunch refusal to budge from his religious beliefs got him burned at the stake by Queen Mary during her campaign to restore England to Catholicism. Her father, King Henry VIII, had taken England out of the Catholic Church when the Pope refused to grant him a divorce from Mary's mother, so he broke with Rome, established the Church of England, and appointed himself its head. Hugh Latimer graduated from Cambridge University, was elected a Fellow of its Clare College in 1510, and became a Catholic priest in 1515. However, he switched to Protestantism in 1524, and became a zealous advocate and defender of his new faith. He gained renown as a Protestant preacher, and was appointed a bishop by Henry VIII in his newly formed Church of England. Although he had established a new church, Henry VIII kept many doctrines and practices of Catholicism. When the king refused to adopt Protestant reforms, Latimer resigned in protest. Number 2. Memorable final words amidst the flames. Henry VIII was succeeded on the throne by his underage son, Edward VI, who was staunchly Protestant. Hugh Latimer regained royal favor, was appointed court preacher, and became the young king's chaplain. However, Edward died young and without issue, and was succeeded by his sister Mary, a staunch Catholic who viewed Protestantism as a heresy, and was determined to restore England to Catholicism. Early in her reign she had prominent Protestants such as Latimer imprisoned and tried for heresy. Latimer, along with fellow Bishop Nicholas Ridley and Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, was tried for heresy in Oxford in 1555. He was convicted when he refused to renounce his faith, and was sentenced to be burned at the stake. Latimer was chained to the stake alongside Ridley. When the flames were lit, Ridley cried out in agony. Latimer sought to comfort him even as he himself was consumed by fire, and uttered his final words through the smoke and flames: "Be of good cheer, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle in England, as I hope by God's grace shall never be put out." It could be argued that the candle still burns. Queen Mary's efforts to restore Catholicism failed. When she died in 1558, she was succeeded by her Protestant sister, Elizabeth I, and England has been Protestant ever since. Number 1. A pirate who became famous because of who he knew, not what he did. John Rackham, better known as Calico Jack, 1682 to 1720, is one of the best-known pirates of the golden age of piracy. That is not because he was particularly successful compared to other famous pirates. His career was middling and his accomplishments mediocre. Instead, his fame rests upon his association with more successful pirates, his venality and backstabbing, which stood out even in a profession built on venality and backstabbing, and because his first mate designed the Jolly Roger flag. Most importantly, he became known because his crew included two famous female pirates, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, and because of Anne Bonny's final words to him. Rackham was nicknamed Calico Jack because of the colorful calico clothes he favored. He was the quartermaster aboard the pirate sloop Ranger in 1718, when she encountered a French man of war twice her size, and the pirate captain, choosing discretion over valor, fled. Rackham and the crew decried what they viewed as cowardice, and soon thereafter they voted the captain out of the command. In his place, the pirates elected Calico Jack. As captain, he specialized in plundering small vessels engaged in coastal trade, but fell upon larger ships when the opportunity presented itself.